The ongoing legal battle involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and
my son's had the flu. I'm not feeling great. My heart was racing. I'm noticing that, I'm having some anxiety and just haven't given myself the time.
Statements, credibility, questions, and accusations of coercion. At the center of the latest development is a court filing from Wayfarer's legal team, in which they argue that they could not have predicted a key witness would completely change his story, an argument that eerily mirrors what was previously reported by a YouTuber named Katie Joy. From the channel Without a Crystal Ball, Katie Joy claimed earlier this year that James Vizuka, Daily Mail reporter, was pressured into signing a statement that contradicted his previous accounts. According to her sources, Vizuka originally said that Leslie Sloan had never claimed Justin Baldoni acted inappropriately toward Blake Lively. Instead, he said Sloan merely noted that Baldoni was disliked on set. However, months later, Vizuka submitted a declaration that claimed Sloan had accused Baldoni of sexual assault. Wayfarer's attorneys are now pushing back, arguing that Vizuka's sudden change in narrative is questionable and not credible. They assert that they could not have foreseen this reversal and acted in good faith when including his original statements in their amended complaint. What makes this situation even more alarming is the claim that Vizuka was threatened with termination if he didn't sign the newer declaration. He signed it and was still allegedly fired. Daily Mail, according to the reporting, had initially promised him job security. That promise was broken. Now Wayfarer's attorneys suggest that his revised statement may have been coerced, and they emphasize that the credibility of that declaration should be scrutinized carefully. Leading Wayfarer's legal argument is Ellen Gaff, an attorney who has been gaining prominence in the case. A graduate of Pepperdine Law School, Gaff has filed key motions, including one that opposed Sloan's request for attorney's fees, and another that successfully compelled the production of documents. Gaff is joined by Columbia Law School graduate Jason Sunshine, who has also been instrumental in the case. Together, they have built a strategy that focuses on facts, federal procedural rules, and a clear rejection of personal attacks or media drama. One of their central legal points is that Sloan's request for attorney's fees under New York's anti-SLAPP statute isn't applicable in this federal case. Wayfarer's team argues that the federal courts in the Second Circuit have made it clear anti-SLAPP laws from states like California and New York don't align with federal rules of civil procedure. The claim is simple: federal courts follow federal rules, and under those rules, Sloan's request doesn't hold. They also argue that their lawsuit was not frivolous. The dismissal of their case came not because the claims had no merit, but because they failed to adequately plead Sloan's specific state of mind. That's a procedural issue, not a condemnation of the case itself. Wayfarer's lawyers stress that they had good reasons to trust the evidence provided to them at the time, including the original texts and messages from Vizuka. At no point, they say, were they acting in bad faith. Sloan's defense, meanwhile, has argued that the lawsuit was intended to punish her for speaking out. She has accused Wayfarer of retaliating against her and using the courts to silence criticism. But Wayfarer's legal team refutes that, arguing that their lawsuit came in direct response to a New York Times expose that destroyed their reputation. The fallout from that article was immediate and severe. According to Wayfarer, it was Sloan in collaboration with Lively and Reynolds who orchestrated the smear campaign. They say their lawsuit was a legitimate attempt to set the record straight. The situation with Vizuka's declaration remains one of the most controversial parts of this case. Initially, he said Sloan never accused Baldoni of misconduct. Then, after the Times article was published, he claimed that Sloan had in fact said that Lively was assaulted. The contradiction was sharp and confusing. And according to Wayfarer's legal team, the newer version of the story simply doesn't make sense. His latest statement, they argue, appears to be inconsistent and possibly the result of external pressure. At the time of their lawsuit, they had no reason to doubt the validity of his original statement. They didn't have a crystal ball, they say, to predict that he would reverse himself. Katie Joy, the YouTuber who previously reported that Vizuka had been coerced, sees this as confirmation of her reporting. According to her, Vizuka had tried to withdraw the declaration, citing inaccuracies and intimidation. He allegedly sought whistleblower protection and was ultimately fired after changing attorneys. While we can't independently verify those claims, they certainly line up with the way Wayfarer's lawyers are now framing the situation in court. There's also the question of whether Wayfarer will appeal the dismissal of their claims against Sloan. Appeals must typically be filed within 30 days, but there are exceptions. Some legal experts suggest that if Wayfarer wins key motions in Blake Lively's case, or if discovery reveals evidence of actual malice, they could revisit the dismissal at a later stage. For now, they seem focused on moving forward with discovery and avoiding unnecessary delays. Filing an appeal would slow things down, and with deadlines approaching in the lively case, they may prefer to keep pushing ahead. In one of their recent filings, Wayfarer's team made it clear this case was dismissed. Before discovery even began, not a single deposition had taken place. No evidence had been fully presented. The court simply found that the allegations weren't strong enough to meet the burden of proof at that stage. But Wayfarer says that doesn't mean the case was groundless. It just means they didn't get the chance to prove it yet. The big question now is whether the courts will agree with Sloan that the lawsuit was retaliatory and should result in sanctions and attorney's fees, or whether Wayfarer's defense built on federal legal standards and an emphasis on good faith will win the day. For now, it's clear that the legal fight is far from over, and that the truth about what happened on set, behind the scenes, and in the press is still unfolding. If the story continues in this direction, more surprising details may emerge, witnesses may testify, declarations may be questioned, and one way or another the courts will decide whether this was an abuse of the legal system or a desperate attempt to salvage reputations from a coordinated public attack. Either way, the stakes remain high, and Hollywood is watching as the legal drama presses forward. The next chapter revolves heavily around the internal conflict brewing within the Daily Mail itself, especially concerning how it handled James Vizuka's statements. The firing of a journalist under suspicious circumstances, after allegedly being coerced into signing a legal document, doesn't just raise eyebrows. It calls into question the editorial independence of one of the world's most well-known tabloid outlets. If Vizuka's claims are accurate and he was pressured to sign a misleading statement with a promise of job security only to be fired afterward, then the ripple effects could be massive. It introduced
human being, so I would really like to see that celebrated.
This time from Vizuka against his former employer Daily Mail for wrongful termination and coercion. But perhaps even more significantly, this raises another legal and ethical issue: whether statements procured through intimidation can be considered reliable evidence in court. Wayfarer's legal team is clearly laying the groundwork to challenge the declaration's credibility if it is used against them in future proceedings. They have not directly accused the Daily Mail or Sloan's team of misconduct in acquiring the declaration, but they've done something more strategic. Cast enough doubt on its legitimacy to give judges a reason to discount it. They argue that they acted with reasonable reliance on what Vizuka originally told them. That, legally speaking, is a powerful defense. It means that even if Vizuka's new version is accepted by the court, Wayfarer's use of his old statement can't be used to prove bad faith. From a legal standpoint, one of the most critical distinctions in all of this is the difference between being wrong and being reckless. Filing a lawsuit based on a statement that later turns out to be unreliable doesn't automatically mean the plaintiff acted in bad faith. Courts make this distinction all the time. If Wayfarer genuinely believed they were defamed and their belief was supported by direct communication from a source like Vizuka, then their actions fall within the bounds of legitimate legal action, even if the case was later dismissed for lacking sufficient evidence. This is the exact point Wayfarer continues to reinforce in its filings, that their claims against Sloan were colorable, in other words, supported by at least some plausible legal and factual basis. They repeatedly highlight that the dismissal of their case wasn't based on any finding that their claims were false or malicious, but rather on a failure to meet technical pleading standards. In the legal world, this is not a minor detail. It's the difference between an incompetent claim and an unethical one. And in this case, Wayfarer is adamant that theirs was neither. It's also worth noting that Sloan's legal strategy appears to hinge on framing herself as the victim of a powerful entity attempting to silence her. Her team continues to push the narrative that the lawsuit itself was retaliatory, designed not to win in court but to intimidate. However, that argument becomes harder to maintain in light of the dismissal not being related to factual inaccuracy but rather pleading insufficiency. Moreover, Sloan's attempt to recover attorneys' fees through the anti-SLAPP statute faces an uphill battle, since federal courts in the Second Circuit have consistently rejected the application of state anti-SLAPP laws in federal cases. That puts her claim on shaky ground from the outset. At the heart of all this legal maneuvering is a much larger story, a story about reputations, power, and who gets to control the public narrative. The original article in the New York Times painted a very specific picture of Justin Baldoni and Wayfarer. According to Wayfarer's side, that picture was deliberately distorted, constructed by a coordinated group involving Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and Leslie Sloan. They argue that these figures used their celebrity influence and media connections to weaponize public opinion in a way that caused real measurable harm to people's careers and lives. Wayfarer's lawyers are now trying To turn the legal tables, they are arguing that the narrative used to harm them is not only false, but strategically built on shaky and potentially manipulated claims. And the Bazooka Declaration is the centerpiece of that argument. If they can discredit it or prove it was obtained under duress, they will be in a much stronger position in both this case and any future ones involving Blake Lively. But there's more. The court filing suggests that Wayfarer believes the real battle will unfold during discovery in the case against Blake Lively. That's where depositions, text messages, emails, and internal communications could be revealed. And depending on what those documents show, Wayfarer might then have the grounds to not only refile some of their original claims but potentially bring new ones. They've hinted that if discovery reveals evidence of malice or fabrication, they could appeal the Sloan dismissal or even pursue additional legal action under a separate cause. That's why they seem hesitant to appeal Sloan's dismissal right now. Filing an appeal would pause the entire case, including discovery in the Lively matter. And according to statements from Wayfarer's legal team, their top priority is to keep discovery moving forward. They want access to documents, they want depositions, and they believe the evidence will eventually speak for itself. What happens next could be explosive. If Wayfarer's claims are accurate and supported by evidence uncovered during discovery, this situation may evolve from a dismissed defamation case into a major countersuit complete with allegations of conspiracy, coercion, and malicious intent. If, on the other hand, discovery fails to produce any new compelling evidence, it may solidify the argument that the lawsuit was always unfounded and serve to protect Sloan, Lively, and Reynolds from further legal exposure. There is also the looming question of whether the Daily Mail will face its own legal scrutiny if James Bazooka chooses to sue for wrongful termination or whistleblower retaliation. The case may expand well beyond Hollywood and enter the broader conversation about journalistic ethics, employment coercion, and the reliability of media-driven evidence in court proceedings. That could trigger even more fallout, particularly if it's revealed that editorial decisions were made with knowledge of how they might influence pending litigation. At this point, the only certainty is that this case is far from over. The pieces are still moving, attorneys are strategizing behind closed doors, discovery is just beginning, and the reputations of everyone involved, Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Leslie Sloan, James Bazooka, and the legal teams on both sides hang in the balance. Whether this ends in a trial, a quiet settlement, or a wave of new lawsuits remains to be seen. But as of now, the legal stage is set for what may be one of the most revealing and consequential court battles in recent entertainment history. As discovery looms, both sides are under intense pressure to present evidence that supports their version of events. For Wayfarer, the goal is to prove that their original claims, particularly the accusations that Leslie Sloan worked in coordination with Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds to defame Justin Baldoni, were made in good faith and supported by what they believe to be credible sources at the time. That includes the early communications from James Bazooka, which they argue were consistent and unambiguous before his sudden reversal. If they can prove that Sloan played a role in pushing a false narrative, their entire legal strategy begins to regain strength. But for that to happen, discovery must continue without delays. This is where things get tense. Blake Lively's legal team has reportedly sought to slow the pace of discovery, possibly to prepare their own defense or to navigate the complications that come with multiple overlapping lawsuits. Wayfarer, however, appears to be resisting any delays. Their filing suggests they want full access to communications, emails, text messages, drafts of media statements, anything that could show coordination between Sloan, Lively, Reynolds, and the press. These materials could be vital not only in defending against current claims, but also in reopening claims that were previously dismissed. If evidence surfaces that demonstrates intentional manipulation of a journalist or planned media leaks with defamatory intent, Wayfarer could revive the defamation argument in a much more aggressive way. They might even consider adding new claims such as tortious interference or civil conspiracy, depending on what's found in discovery, but it's a high-stakes gamble. If discovery yields nothing conclusive, their legal credibility may suffer further, and it could affirm the current court's decision that their case lacked sufficient grounding from the beginning. Meanwhile, the court itself is walking a fine line. Federal judges typically don't like litigants using the legal system to settle personal vendettas, but they also don't want to discourage legitimate defamation claims, especially when reputational and financial damage can be proven. That's why the ruling on Sloan's motion for attorney's fees was so closely watched. The court's refusal to grant sanctions or award fees sends a message: the case may have been weak, but not necessarily malicious. It leaves room for Wayfarer to regroup and continue building its case with a stronger evidentiary foundation. On the public side, this entire situation has had unpredictable consequences. Once a carefully managed Hollywood image, Blake Lively now finds herself in the middle of a multi-layered legal controversy. While she hasn't spoken publicly about the case, public perception is inevitably shifting. The idea that someone in her inner circle, her publicist, may have participated in spreading unverified or potentially false accusations is damaging, even if the legal findings are eventually in her favor. Justin Baldoni too is in a precarious position. Though the defamation claims were dismissed against Sloan, the allegations from Lively's CRD complaint remain a threat. If those claims gain traction in court, Wayfarer's narrative of being the victim of a coordinated smear campaign could collapse. If they don't, it could provide validation for everything Wayfarer has been arguing so far. For now, both sides are trying to control the story, not just in court filings but in the media. Lively and Reynolds, through silence and tight legal control, are trying to project professionalism and strength. Wayfarer, on the other hand, is more openly aggressive, filing motions that call into question the ethics of their opponents and the reliability of major media outlets. They are clearly fighting not just for a court victory but for reputation recovery. This also speaks to a broader trend in high-profile defamation and misconduct cases, especially in the entertainment industry. Increasingly, legal teams are using discovery and court documents not just as legal tools but as public relations weapons. When carefully timed and strategically worded, filings can shape headlines, influence social media narratives, and even silence critics. In that way, the legal process becomes part of a larger media strategy, one that unfolds in both the courtroom and the public eye. One of the more unsettling parts of the situation is how it exposes the fragility of journalistic integrity under pressure. If a journalist can be forced to change his statement to support one side of a lawsuit and then be fired anyway, it calls into question how much independence the media truly has, especially when its reporters are tied up in stories involving celebrities, lawyers, and billion-dollar studios. The legal pressure is real, but so is the pressure to protect high-profile relationships' reputation.
Pretty amazing. You don't need to be...
Brings us back to the key legal question: were Wayfarer's claims against Sloan made in bad faith, or were they based on reasonable if flawed assumptions? If discovery reveals documents or messages that support Wayfarer's claims even partially, the narrative could shift dramatically. A case once dismissed as weak could become something far more serious. But if no such evidence surfaces and Sloan, Lively, and Reynolds maintain their position with consistency and documentation, Wayfarer's argument might fall apart permanently. In the meantime, Katie Joy's reporting, once brushed aside by some as YouTube gossip, is becoming more relevant. The court documents are beginning to reflect details she mentioned long before they appeared in legal filings, especially about James Bazooka and the questionable nature of his revised declaration. Whether or not Wayfarer's attorneys intentionally echoed her claims, the overlap suggests they're aware of what's being said online, and whether or not Wayfarer's attorneys intentionally echoed her claims, the overlap suggests they're aware of what's being said online, and that public commentary may be...
Because it's so celebrated. This is what someone can look like after a baby, and
Parties involved in various lawsuits now in motion, it's increasingly difficult to predict where this all leads. But one thing is certain: no matter how this ends, it will be studied closely by lawyers, journalists, and entertainment insiders for years to come. It's a case study in modern legal warfare where publicists, press leaks, legal threats, and shifting testimonies all collide in one messy, high-profile courtroom brawl. The next few months will be critical. Depositions could begin, email chains could emerge, private conversations might be read aloud in court, and we may finally learn who was telling the truth and who was simply playing the game better. As this saga approaches its next turning point, what becomes undeniably clear is that the legal conflict between Wayfarer, Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and Leslie Sloan has grown far beyond a traditional defamation case. It's now a battle about credibility, access to power, and the dangerous intersection between public relations and the legal system. With every new filing, with every shift in testimony, a larger story is taking shape, one that paints a revealing portrait of how information, influence, and reputation are weaponized in Hollywood. That's where all the speculation, accusations, and finger-pointing must be backed by hard evidence. If Wayfarer can't produce proof that Sloan and others acted with malice or coordinated a smear campaign, their case
Everybody knows it. they have a similar sense of humor.
in private communications or corroborated testimony, that supports their theory the balance could shift dramatically in their favor. The most volatile element remains the declaration from James Vizuka. If that document is discredited or linked to coercive practices, it could be the spark that ignites renewed litigation not just against Sloan or Lively, but potentially even the Daily Mail, that would not only shift the narrative but also expose one of the entertainment industry's worst-kept secrets: the immense pressure placed on media professionals to toe the line when legal and celebrity interests are at stake. At the same time, there is still a significant risk for Wayfarer. Should discovery reveal no malicious intent, no coordinated campaign, and no knowingly false statements from Sloan or Lively, they will have lost more than a lawsuit. They will have undermined their own credibility. Their strategy based on reclaiming reputation and public trust would collapse under the weight of
You gave birth to a human being.
to themselves. By keeping the conflict alive in such a public and confrontational manner, for Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, this case will likely always exist in the background even if they're never found liable. Their team's silence so far may have helped avoid inflaming the situation, but the court of public opinion often remembers accusations more than outcomes. Regardless of what happens in the courtroom, questions about how this lawsuit started and what role, if any, they played in shaping media narratives will remain part of the public discourse. Justin Baldoni, meanwhile, stands at a crossroads. If Wayfarer can't deliver on their claims, he may have to find a separate legal avenue to repair his reputation, which was very publicly damaged by the New York Times article and the subsequent media storm. But if the lawsuit gains traction, again through discovery, and especially if Sloan's dismissal is eventually overturned, Baldoni could emerge not as a disgraced public figure but as someone who was unfairly targeted by a powerful network of media and celebrity influence. In the broader context, this case is a cautionary tale for the entertainment industry. It shows how quickly things can spiral when media leaks become legal weapons, when reporters are pressured to play along, and when publicists and lawyers blur the lines between protecting clients and controlling narratives. It also demonstrates how fragile reputations really are, not just for celebrities but for entire companies' legal teams and media outlets. Even now, many questions remain unanswered. Will Wayfarer attempt to refile claims based on new evidence? Will the court allow them to revisit Sloan's dismissal after discovery in the Lively case? Will James Vizuka ever publicly explain the contradictions in his statements? And if he does, what impact will it have on the case and his own career? Could the Daily Mail face a lawsuit of its own? And most importantly, will the courts ever be able to untangle what was really true and what was just strategically planted misinformation? Whatever happens next, the case has already become a symbol of something larger. How the truth can be manipulated, how the media can be used as both sword and shield, and how powerful people often clash behind the scenes in ways the public never fully sees. It's a modern media legal war playing out on red carpets, in newsrooms, and inside federal courtrooms. And it's a reminder that in Hollywood, the show is never really over, it just moves to a new stage. One thing is certain: the final word in this conflict has not yet been spoken. But when it is, it won't just impact the parties involved. It will set precedent, spark debate, and leave behind a blueprint for how future public legal disputes will be waged in an era where media exposure is just as powerful as any judge's ruling.